Hello, my name is Darlene Susa-Anderson, and for the next while, I'll be reviewing with you Canada's Hazardous Product Regulation, also known as HPR, which was issued in February of 2015, and I'll be highlighting some of the key sections and sharing with you some strategies for compliance. First of all, these regulations themselves were issued on February 11, 2015, and they were issued through Part 2 of the Canada Gazette. The web link here at the second bullet will give you access to that particular document. In this document, starting on page 15, is where the text of the Hazardous Product Regulations begin, and it runs for 96 pages. The last 37 pages which accompany this particular section is called the Regulatory Impact Analysis Statement, and as you can see by the fine print here, this is not part of the regulations and the orders. However, it does provide some very useful insight into how this regulation was developed and how it relates to other jurisdictions. So let's highlight a few key points at this point. So HPR itself was written against Revision 5 of the Purple Book, but it did state that it sought, and I put this in quotes, to align the system with that of the United States and other key trading partners to enable the use of a single SDS and label that meets requirements in both Canada and the U.S. And I want to point out to everyone that U.S. HASCOM 2012 is against Revision 3 of the Purple Book. So that appears, at least on the surface, to present some inconsistencies. So I would say that Canada GHS is aligned with the U.S. GHS to some extent, and we'll highlight a few of those here on this slide. First of all, in terms of the excluded building blocks, both U.S. and Canada exclude all environmental hazard classes, and that's acute and aquatic toxicity, chronic aquatic toxicity, and hazardous to the ozone layer. U.S. and Canada are also aligned in what additional building blocks have been added to the scope of the regulations: pyrophoric gases, simple asphyxiants, and combustible dust. And also there is a term in the U.S. called HNOC, for hazards not otherwise classified, and Canada retained that portion of it but subdivided it into a HHNOC, the first H standing for health, and a PHNOC, the P standing for physical. Also in alignment are excluded health hazard categories and subcategories, such as acute toxicity, Category 5, skin corrosion irritation, Category 3, aspiration hazard, Category 2. So this simply just highlights where there is alignment. Now, there's some areas where there are some differences. So in Canada, the regulation of biohazardous infectious materials continues. U.S. does not have that under their HCS 2012. Also, in Canada, there is a requirement for English and Canadian French, so 2 languages, and is expressed in the HPR as in conformity with the requirements of the Official Languages Act. The information on an SDS or label must be in both official languages of Canada. This information may appear on a single bilingual safety data sheet or label, or on 2 separate unilingual safety data sheets and labels. So let me talk a little bit about labeling differences between the 2 countries. First of all, in relation to carcinogenicity, the HPR requires a label on all mixtures containing a carcinogen ingredient at a concentration of 0.1% or more. HCS 2012 makes a label optional for mixtures containing a Category 2 carcinogen at a concentration between 0.1 and 1%. As far as the HNOC and Canada's equivalent to that of PHNOC and HHNOC, HPR requires the labeling elements on all products classified in these classes, but HCS 2012 does not. And finally, when you have a substance or mixture when in contact with water, releases a gas that is acutely toxic. Now recall that the Purple Book does have reacted with water releasing a flammable gas as one of the endpoints that is captured, but they do not have contact when in contact with water releasing a substance that is considered toxic. So Canada added that in, and Canada also requires and specifies supplemental hazard statements in the label for products that meet this criteria, and U.S. does not require a supplemental label element for this category of products. So let's talk about the safety data sheet. Of course, U.S. and Canada are in alignment here in both requiring a 16-section format, and they are in alignment by saying that the contents in sections 12 to 15 are considered optional. Section headings must remain, but the content is optional. So there's nothing in the regulations or any guidance documents that would give you any direction on what to put there. Also, section 3 of the safety data sheet is where the ingredients, the hazardous ingredients, has to be disclosed, and both countries do require component disclosure for any components that contribute to the health hazards, and they both require the chemical name and the concentration or concentration range. Now, this U.S. and Canada recently came out with a guidance document. They came out with a guidance document at the end of July, and that guidance document is titled Disclosure of Ingredient Concentrations and Concentration Ranges on Safety Data Sheets. And in this guidance document, it provides some additional clarity on when concentration ranges are permitted. And I want to refer the listener of the webinar to that particular document for the specific details of when concentrations are permitted. Also in Canada, information on the initial supplier is required in Section 1, and for the most part that needs to be a Canadian point of contact. What is gone that Canada used to have is a mandatory 3-year review period for safety data sheets, and what is also gone is something called an ingredient disclosure list, or the IDL, that no longer factors in to the requirements. Also gone are the mandatory concentration ranges, and what I mean by that is in WMIS 1988, concentration ranges were permitted if the substance itself wasn't able to be exactly identified concentration, and there were fixed concentration ranges that were permitted. And so these mandatory concentration ranges are no longer listed, but there still is the same requirement for publication of inclusion of exact concentration. And again, concentration ranges are only in limited circumstances. As far as the labeling requirements under HBR 2015, you do need to include on the label the name of the product, the initial supplier identifier, and for the most part that needs to be a Canadian point of contact. And the way this is worded in HBR is information elements that are specified for that category or subcategory in Section 3 of Annex 3 of the GHS. And if you look in the definitions section, GHS is defined as the 5th revised edition. So that would mean that you would need to look to Annex 3 of the 5th revision of the Purple Book to determine the correct hazard pictogram, signal word, hazard statement, precautionary statements to use associated with a specific classification. They're not provided in the text of the HBR. This is different than the U.S. The U.S. indeed does provide the text, and that's through Appendix C. As far as the label elements for those endpoints which are not found in the Purple Book, such as combustible dust, simple asphyxiants, pyrophoric gases, PHNOC, HHNOC, and biohazardous infectious materials, you need to look to Schedule 5 of the HBR, and this slide just gives you a snapshot of the first 3. Canada recognizes that small capacity containers can be challenging in terms of inclusion of all the required label elements. So they did provide some flexibility and they did specify two sizes. There's a less than 100 ml size, and the HPR states that the only exemption is elimination of precautionary hazard statements on the label. And then they do recognize that you might even have smaller containers, such as less than 3 ml. And HPR does say that if the label interferes with the normal use of the product, the label would be required to remain durable and legible only during transport and storage, but could be removed during use. So think a visual of an ampule or a syringe, where a label that would include all the required label elements would tend to interfere with the use of that particular container. What is gone on the label is a statement referencing that an SDS is available. That's no longer part of the regulation. And then the hatched border itself surrounding the required label elements is also no longer required. As far as updating documents, HPR does state if significant new data, and I put that in quotes because in another slide or two I'll actually give you the definition for that. If significant new data is available, the SDS must be updated within 90 days, and the label themselves must be updated within 180 days. And that time frame does match the US, 90 days and 180 days for MSDSs, or SDSs, excuse me, and the label respectively. Now the next bullet I put in bold because this is what HPR states, but US does not state the same thing. However, the regulations also stipulate that the new information and date upon which it became available must be transmitted by the seller of the product to the person who acquires it, or obtained or prepared by the importer of the product in written form. And it did include the rest of the surrounding text, but basically this means if you are selling this product and you are aware of new information but have yet to update your safety data sheet or your label because you're still within that 90-day or 180-day window, you still need to communicate in some fashion to the receiver of the product that there's been new information. Significant new data itself is defined as any new data regarding the hazard presented by a hazardous product that changes its classification or changes the way to protect against the hazard presented by the hazardous product. So this is very useful in that Canada does specify exactly what they mean by significant new data. As far as the transition period goes, if you look on the text of the HPR, it's written out for you in text form in terms of phases. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, and completion. And while this is accurate and it does deliver the transition provisions, I prefer to look at the transition periods in the regulatory impact analysis portion of the published text because it does provide it to you in a table. It does outline the phases 1, 2, 3, and completion. It does give you the date, and it does give you the entity to which it applies. So to me, this is just a much cleaner way to look at what your obligations are. And I want to back up one slide and point out that although we are past February 11th, 2015, the regulatory content did come into force on the day of publication. So if you wanted to, on February 11th or 12th or so forth, to use the regulatory requirements to comply with Canada's requirements, you were permitted. I also want to point out this bullet here, and that's also found here in this footnote, that once we're at the completion date, which is December 1st, 2018, if you are an employer and you have products in your possession that comply with the CPR, Controlled Product Regulation, then you have an additional 6 months in which to use that product and not have that converted over. So that is an allowance to give employers who purchase material from suppliers a little bit of extra time to get into compliance. That was at the federal level, and I wanted to point out that at the federal level there is no reference in the HPR to training or occupational exposure limits. And if you're interested in what those requirements are, you have to look at the provinces and territory requirements. And at the province and territory level, they do focus on the workplace, and they will address these areas. Now, there is a website that has been developed called the National WHMIS Portal, WHMIS.org. And if you go to that website, this is the opening screen. If you continue on that website, you do get a map of Canada showing all the territories and provinces. And you can either click on a particular area that you're interested in, or come down at the bottom and click on province or territory in order to take a look at what that particular unit has to say in relation to WHMIS 2015. So if you're looking for any of these are all the territories and provinces in Canada. And I want to just give you one example of Ontario. So if you were clicking on the map for Ontario, it would come up with information that gives you WHMIS status. It gives you other information such as communications and resources too. But it gives you what the status is of the proposed WHMIS requirements. So you need to look at each of those in order to get a complete picture. And my understanding is, although this is a government-maintained website, that sometimes there is a time lag between whenever a province or territory updates some information. There's a little bit of a time lag before it actually gets here in a summary form. So to be perfectly cautious, you probably want to make sure you're always looking at the province and territory website directly too as well, in addition to the summary. So what we can say at this point, because this is an evolving situation, is that every province and territory in Canada has made a commitment to incorporate and implement the federal legislation. And the intention is to amend existing acts and regulations, but in some cases, new legislation will have to be developed. So the final slides here are, what do you do? How do you get into compliance? What I've gone over so far is just some highlights of what is in the HPR, what you can find in there, and what you'll need to look at the province and territory level for. So as far as getting into compliance, some of the things that you can think about doing are, number one, get educated. So certainly listening to this webinar is a great first step, but it is a very short time. We do have a full day of training on Canada, so you can look to the ChemADVISOR.com website to see when the classes or next classes will be scheduled. What you can also do is to understand what products that you have that are either sold into Canada or are currently manufactured into Canada. You next need to develop a compliance plan, and ChemADVISOR would be happy to work with you to develop that roadmap. And we do have a whole set of senior consultants who have been in regulatory compliance for a number of years that are able to assist in development of a process. If you do identify that safety data sheets and labels need to be revised, and I can guarantee you that they will need to be revised because the old requirements are in no way a match with the new requirements, and you're limited on your resources to do that, ChemADVISOR also has authors that can do that for you. Also, you will need to train your employees, and that will happen based on the provincial and territory requirements. And certainly ChemADVISOR can help with that as well. And if you need to train your regulatory staff and the requirements, you can attend one of our training classes. If you need to train your employees, then you need to talk with us about the best way to accomplish that. And finally, as content becomes available, as provinces and territories publish information, we do provide ongoing updates through our blog. So follow our ChemADVISOR blog for more updates. Thank you for your time.